In this video, by request, I'm going to introduce you to some of the ideas about color management. I've actually posted several videos that will get you into a lot more technical detail and even some very practical detail of exactly what you need to do to get color management going in your own space. Some of those things you'll be able to accomplish. Many of them actually do require some special equipment. But in this video, I just want to actually tell you what color management is, what the idea of it is, and why it is so important ultimately in digital photography. So what is color management? Well, digital photography is a very complicated thing. It seems quite simple. We just snap the picture, we see it on our LCD screen, and voila, we have that picture. However, the actual process of getting from what we see to a final print is more complicated. Our eye is where we start. We look at the world, we see it in certain colors, we see it in certain densities and luminosities. And we want to actually pick up our camera and grab what we see with our eye and put it into the camera. So we go from our eye, which has a certain capacity for seeing color, to our camera, which has a different capacity for seeing color. Because, of course, the camera has to record it with its own little computer system, its own device. And so it actually has to do a translation of what we see with our eye. It has what we call its own color space. Now, from the camera, we need to go to the monitor. The monitor is actually more important in a sense than the computer because the monitor is the visual. The monitor is where we see the image, and that monitor has a certain color space, a certain representation, and a certain capability that we look at the image when we're editing it, and we what we see on the monitor is what we ultimately want to pull out of the printer. The printer, of course, has its own color space, and so it has to interpret what it gets from the monitor. In It has to interpret what is on the monitor that's translated back to the computer into the printer and then to the print. Now, while paper doesn't have a color profile built into it technically, it does have its own color profile because it has its own capability of translating the color from the inks of the printer onto the paper. Okay, have I overwhelmed you enough yet? This is color management. It's actually both much simpler and much more complicated than just what I explained. But let's just keep it to its basic. Color management is a way of translating the color that we see with our eye to our camera, to the monitor, to the printer, and ultimately to the print. Now, how does it do that? It does it through the use of translations that rely on what we call color spaces. Okay, let me get into a little bit of a trippy area, which may seem a little bit abstract. Oops, let's go back here. Great. May seem a little bit abstract, but actually makes this very abstract idea quite visual. And it's one of my favorite areas to play with for color management and for demonstrated color management. So this is in a Mac, and it's an area called the Color Sync utility. If you have a Mac or access to a Mac, you can go in and play with this. You need to have some profiles loaded up to compare, but there'll always be a few things to start. So I've actually scrolled down and I picked on ProPhoto RGB. This is a very large color profile, which is really the profile that we work in when you're in Lightroom. It's the profile that is being used in the display area to translate colors. It's the area that we use in Photoshop, or the color space that we use in Photoshop. And color spaces are also known as gamuts. They are essentially these visual translations, or they are the capability of any given instrument or space to show color. So what this is, it looks like a giant spaceship. It's actually showing all of the colors, the luminosity from darks to lights, and all the different colors on the spectrum that are capable within this color space, this ProPhoto color space, which is actually a very large space. Now, This is going to be a little bit confusing, but I want to go ahead and introduce you to this idea. Most monitors, your monitor in particular, I'm sure, and maybe your monitor isn't even up to this, are not going to be able to represent all of these colors. Your camera might be able to capture them, but your monitor cannot display them. And this is one of the tricks of color management. Let's actually just show you. I'm going to do this little trick where I hold this for comparison. And I'm actually going to click on Adobe RGB. This is what most monitors can actually display. So this might be a little shocking and disappointing to realize that Adobe RGB, which is actually a pretty nice color space, it's the one that we set to when we're doing JPEGs in our cameras because it's a vast improvement over sRGB. But this color space is very, very small. Look at all the colors that we cannot see that are in this ProPhoto space. Now, and actually there's really nowhere that we can display all of the colors that are visible in ProPhoto. And you might ask, well, what the heck is ProPhoto for? If it's so big that we can't even see it on any given device or any paper that we can look at, why should we have such a big space? Well, I'll try to explain that. It may or may not be absolutely clear, but I'll try to give you a little bit of an idea of what's going on here. Okay, let's go ahead and release this from comparison. So we'll go back, oops, I want to go back to the ProPhoto because I want to start with this very large space, which is what we work in most softwares that we're playing with. And how come I lost it all the way down here in the P's? There it is, it's hiding. So let's go back to this and let's compare this to the color spaces of some of the papers that you may print on. This is a list of paper profiles that are loaded in from my computer and on a printer that I use here. And I can go ahead and hold that Adobe ProPhoto for comparison. And let's just grab, for instance, Premium Paper Glossy. Now, it fits very much within this ProPhoto space. But look at this, and this is just a hint of what might be coming. There's just this tiny bit of the paper that actually expresses an area that isn't even visible in ProPhoto. So it's actually capable of printing a color that's not in ProPhoto. Okay, let's actually do a more direct comparison. Let's clear this comparison and let's go back and grab the Adobe RGB. Because this is what we would actually be looking at on our monitors. So you're in the lab or you're on your computer at home and you're looking, this is the color space that's present on a good monitor at home. Let's look at that same paper. We're on Premium Glossy. Oops, sorry, I forgot to hold for comparison. So let's do that same paper. We'll hold this for comparison and let's go to the Premium Glossy. Now this is really startling and I'll show you a few more. But do you realize now that this paper can print? There's some colors that are in this color space that the paper can't get to over here in the blues and the magentas, but there are other areas in these deep blues, in the reds and greens, that the paper can display even though it cannot be displayed on your screen. Well, this is kind of trippy, and hopefully this right here is giving you a sense of why color management is so important and so complicated. The problem is that what we're looking at on the screen has more colors than our paper is capable of, and our paper is capable of more colors than our screen is capable of. So how do we move things from one to the other? Well, we have some great technologies that will help us with this. Again, I'm doing this very quick video. I'm going to keep it, I hope, under 15 minutes. And it's going to give you the tiniest, tiniest little idea of what color management is and what it can do. But it will give you an idea of why color management is so important. Okay, I'm going to come out of this color sync utility. It's a good place to play. I'll also take this guy down. Oops, now I want to go the other direction. Hang on. I'm going to click him out, and I want to come into Lightroom. And I've chosen as an example, we're in the Lightroom Develop module, and I've chosen as an example an image that I shot up in Lock in an interior. It has quite a bit of color. We'll probably, depending on how my time goes, I might show you another one. And we're in the Develop module. Now remember that the Develop module, as close as possible, is using the ProPhoto color space as a way of showing colors. But this monitor itself is not capable of showing all of those colors. We're looking at something that's probably closer to the Adobe RGB color space. We do, however, in this module have it's a very limited tool, but it's a great starting point for understanding color management. And it's also a great starting point after you calibrate your monitor, which will be talked about in other videos. It's a great starting point for doing some color management at home on your own devices. So down here underneath this image, we have a little button that's called Soft Proofing. Depending on what classes you've had with me, I may or may not have introduced this to you. At some points, I'll introduce this to an individual student. And we'll definitely get into this in some of the later classes if you haven't done it already. So if I click this button, I get this little proof preview with a little white border around it. And if I go over here, notice that if I take this off, this goes away. If I click this on, this proofing window comes up. Okay? Right now the profile is on, I was actually messing around with it. It's on display P3, which is a fairly big color space. We'll go ahead and do it on Adobe RGB. And on these first three, this is sRGB. And sRGB, by the way, actually represents the limitations of colors on the web. So you're probably not going to see anything terribly dramatic happen between these. Not because things aren't happening. You can see that there are some changes happening definitely up in the histogram, but because just visually we're not capable of seeing those subtleties. But if we come down here, we'll go ahead and start with that premium glossy paper. And notice what happened. All of a sudden, there's a very dramatic shift. The image gets deeper. The reds actually drop off a little bit. And that has to do with how this particular image will translate onto that paper using the profile that is stored in this computer. Now that's very important. The profile that's stored in here is a profile, it's what we call a canned profile, an ICC, International Color Consortium profile, which is connected to this printer and this paper that I'm using. So if we use this and we print on this device, that is the ultimate result we're going to get. Let's go back to the Adobe RGB so you can see that difference again. So you can see we've lost a great deal of saturation and a little bit of the density in the shadows. Now, why is this useful? Let's just say, obviously, if you are looking at this and you print onto this paper without looking at the soft proofing, you're just looking at the Adobe RGB, you're going to pull out your print and you're going to go, ugh, wow, that's so dull. But what if we went to the soft proofing? By the way, this is, I mentioned before, it's a crude tool, but it's a very helpful tool to get started with. I can create a proof copy. Oh, there we go. So that I can do this just on one proof. And on this proof, I can actually change my vibrance. And see what I'm doing is I'm trying to make this proof copy look very similar to the original saturation that I wanted. This is going to give me a print that's far closer to what I was dreaming of. Now, please don't think that I've suddenly given you the magic bullet that's going to fix all color management problems. I'll show you one other just to give you a little bit of an example. Because this is just the middle piece in a whole series of pieces that have to happen. Our camera is kind of the least of our worries, but there are some things you can do later in your cameras. But your monitor that you look at must be calibrated, or this process that I'm doing right now is useless. You must have downloaded profiles that are specific to your printer and to the paper that you're using, or this process is useless. So there are things going on before and after this that have to be in place for this to actually function, but you can see just visually it's a nice illustration of how color management can work. Now, one thing you might have realized is that what we're looking at on the monitor can't possibly ever mimic what happens on the paper. We already looked at that glossy paper, and we know that there are colors that will show up in that paper that can't be represented in Adobe RGB. But we can actually ask and computers are very smart things, we can ask our monitor to interpret that and give us something that perceptually will look as close as possible. So again, now we're back to this mushiness. A lot of it has to do with how we perceive it, but there are ways that we can actually standardize and be more technical in this process throughout so that we can get closer. Okay, I'm going to show you one other paper just so you can get a sense for how dramatic this can be, and then I'll go ahead and stop this video and let you go explore some of the videos that have more detail if you're interested. Let me just show you very quickly a fine art paper, and this is really typical of the fine art papers. This is a matte paper. It's called Velvet Fine Art, and when we go to this, you can see, and actually let's go out of the proof copy, back to the original. So if we go back to the Velvet Fine Art, you can see how very strongly this soft proofing changes the look of that. We lose a lot of the crispness, a lot of the richness of the black. So again, each of these papers, as we go through, you're going to find that there are different kinds of density, tonality, etc. If you're noticing that the glossy papers tend to be a little bit like the sateen, this is a very nice paper. They tend to actually record things better. A lot of that is true. The glossy papers have a larger color space and a larger capability. So these are all things to consider when we get back to hopefully the real printing world, or if you're working on printing at home. Enjoy!